can be, once they do start enforcing, there will be up to $10,000 penalties for each violation of the act, which is a scary thought considering we're in an environment where, if you're issuing multiple bills in a single occurrence of care, that might be 9 times 10,000, right? So
Right.
That's a concern that I think people should be aware of. It's a little bit premature. We're not in the enforcement period yet, but I think it's safe to say in 2024, I would expect that enforcement rulings will start coming down.
Welcome to Medical Money Matters, the podcast where you can find experts, answers, and resources so that you can achieve mastery over the financial and business aspects of your practice. Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Jill Arena. I began my career in accounting and finance, and I have more than 30 years of experience running medical groups. I own and operate a national healthcare consulting and revenue cycle company, and I am the author of Physician Heal Thy Financial Self. In 2020, I co-founded the Physician Leadership Project, and my passion is to increase financial and business literacy for physicians. Welcome, everyone. My guest today is Grant Engrav, healthcare attorney and one of the nation's specialists on the No Surprises Act. Grant has received the designation of Rising Star among super lawyers, and he also serves on the executive committee for the health law portion of the Oregon Bar Association. And he is also general counsel for the Oregon Ambulatory Surgical Center Association, better known as OASCA. And Grant, welcome. Thanks for being with us today.
Thanks, Jill. It's great to be here.
I appreciate you joining us. We have also, Grant and I have had the opportunity to work together. He has a very close working relationship with the Oregon Board of Medical Examiners and routinely works with physician clients on matters that come before the board. So I have always appreciated that about the work that you do, Grant, on behalf of physicians. So thank you for that.
I appreciate that too. It's good. It's good work. It's interesting times with the board, so we're happy to be a part of that.
I imagine so. That's wonderful. Well, we are here today to talk about the No Surprises Act, which has been in effect for a while, and I think we're at that space now where practices are beginning to experience, the full impact of it, the full ramifications of it. So I wonder if you could start just for our physician audience with a little bit of background on the act itself and its purpose and then when it was drafted.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe the easiest way to set that up is to offer an example, right? So if we could imagine, let's say I got a busted knee and I'm going to go get an orthopedic surgeon to take care of it at a local hospital. I might think that, hey, I'm in network here and everything is going to be paid for from my health insurance. But lo and behold, 4 months after the surgery, I get a nasty gram from the anesthesiologist saying that I owe them $40,000 for the services or whatever the cost might be. And I say, no, I'm not paying for that. I thought I was in network. There's a dispute. If the anesthesiologist tries to push that bill, we refer to it as a balanced bill. And the No Surprises Act's goal, giving them the good faith, or the benefit of the doubt there, is that they are trying to eliminate balance billing, and they're trying to put the consumer or patient in a position that they are going to avoid that mess. And then also, if it all works properly, it should help the provider as well. So that's the goal of the act. It's been recently enacted. And since its enactment, there has been a series of guidance from the federal government departments that are implementing and enforcing it. And those things have come in ad hoc. And there was actually a recent one as of March 16th, which maybe we'll be able to talk about at the end.
Yes, absolutely. Well, as ever, the laws get written and then they get defined in the courts. So that'll be good. We'll circle back on that one. And I appreciate the example. So as I understand it, the law as it's aptly named, actually one of the few laws that's aptly named, is to help prevent surprise medical bills for patients and to potentially encourage people in the industry to coordinate a little bit better so that patients don't get a nasty surprise or a nasty gram. I like that term. And I think that's harkens, and I kept meaning to look up the statistics on this, but I know it's a very high percentage of personal bankruptcies in this country have at their core a large medical expense. And that's frequently the number one cause of personal bankruptcy is those unexpected medical bills that perhaps insurance isn't covering. So what's your sense for how the new legislation is working out practically in the physician offices?
Practically, it has been a little bit of a mess from what I've seen because of the guidance, and it is very long. It's very complex. I think the actual act is over 1,000 pages, um, and the guidance has come in and it's been filling some of the holes, but not all of them from time to time. So if you're out there and you're feeling confused by the act, you're not alone. In fact, there was this recent guidance was actually the result of the Texas Medical Association's um, litigation where they challenged the qualifying payment amount under the act. And just to back up real quick, the qualifying payment amount, or QPA, is the way the act tells the third party decision maker to evaluate how much is actually due to the provider. And it gets really complicated. But the simple narration of the recent lawsuit was that the Texas Medical Association challenged the formula for the QPA, saying that it's unfair to providers, and they prevailed in federal court. And the
Mm,
most recent guidance that we've had actually was an attempt to remedy that unfairness. And so they brought a little bit more balance to the equation. But that's just one of the examples. I mean, good faith estimates, who's the convening provider. There's a lot of things out there that the clinics that I work with are, have struggled with. And but I would say now that some time has gone by, some people are starting to get the rhythm. It's a big operational challenge, but they're starting to get a hang of
wonderful. Yeah, we can talk a little bit more about the front desk, and we actually have some information in upcoming episodes about the front desk and how to get a handle on the various different operational changes that need to happen. I'm really glad to hear you talking about the Texas Medical Association and their impact positively for other physician groups across the country. And it's I frequently run into physicians who have some notion that they belong to the state medical association, but not a lot of really concrete, like, why do they belong to that and what does that association actually do for them? So I love to hear positive outcomes of the lobby from any of the medical associations across the country. So that's fantastic. Texas was in there, winning one for everybody. Uh,
Yeah, maybe it's just the vantage point of a lawyer, but a lot of the cases that we read have, the various state and then medical association with their name on it, because this litigation is not simple. You can't walk into most law offices around the country and say, "Hey, we want to, sue the federal government for the unfairness and the No Surprises Act." So definitely some props to Texas and their association
yeah,
for doing that.
that's fantastic. Now, how about interesting stories you've heard?
Yeah, I think probably the one that comes to mind is on the good faith estimates. I think that has been one of the most confusing things for providers to juggle. And also, it's a ubiquitous requirement. In other words, as the law defines it, it applies to all healthcare providers. So a lot of the No Surprises Act only applies to very nuanced areas in the practice of medicine. So emergency services, and we're talking about out of network providers in some situations. But the good faith estimate requirement applies to all healthcare providers. And most of my colleagues and I have interpreted that to, be the plain meaning of that expression. So it's going to apply to physical therapy, it's going to apply to mental health. You name a provider, and it'll likely apply to them. And so that creates interesting problems where if we're imagining a healthcare context that's not, hey, you're having a surgery and here's how much it's going to cost. If we can imagine something more like a mental health environment where the patient or client might be being seen once every other week until the end of time, possibly, how do you provide the patient with a good faith estimate? And the guidance has started to do a better job in regard to that. And so basically, the way my clients have started to handle that is they give at the outset of treatment a 1 or 2 page summary of what the recurring charges are, an estimated frequency, and use a little bit of common sense, but try to put the patient in a position where they will at least understand the incoming bills that will occur over time.
That's fantastic. The thinking a little bit more about that, and I appreciate the example of the ongoing care for a patient too, and if that's routine care, how challenging that could be for the practice to provide an estimate. Do you do that on a monthly basis or a quarterly basis? So we'll keep watching for more guidance on how to do that well. As you look at the whole landscape, what types of practices do you think are most heavily impacted?
I think that's a great question, and I think there is a clear answer for that. I think it's going to be any facility that performs surgeries or hospitals.
Yep.
And the reason for so in the No Surprises Act, the balance billing prohibitions only apply to what the Act calls a healthcare facility, and it does list those entities. So a hospital would be one, an ASC would be one, an independent freestanding emergency department would be another.
Mhm.
And so there's heavy restrictions on those facilities, and it requires them to follow the No Surprises Act rules before balance billing. In the manner in which it affects them is connected to the very last part of the act, which is the IDR, or the Independent Dispute Resolution provisions. And
Mhm.
what that means is the act says, okay, the provider is going to balance bill the patient, assuming they've done everything right. The patient doesn't want to pay. Maybe the health insurance will be there behind the scenes. In fact, usually they will. How are we going to determine what the charge is in this health care context when there was no contract and there's not an in-network rate? And we talked a little bit about the QPA earlier. The IDR system is designed to basically act as a arbitration service, in other words, a judicial service where it will adjudicate the dispute between the provider and whoever is on the hook for paying the bill. And probably one of the biggest shortfalls of the drafters of the bill is not anticipating just how much IDR business there would be. I think in the recent guidance, it talked about expecting something like 20,000 IDR cases to be filed within the first year. And if I remember
Yep.
correctly, the actual number was over like
Oh
150,000.
my
So
goodness.
yeah,
Wow.
there's a
Okay. That's a yeah, that was kind of a swing and a miss on the estimate there, wasn't it? Yeah.
little bit.
Oh my goodness. Wow. Well, as you think about the legislation at a high level, what do you want physician owners to know?
Yeah, I think there's a couple big ticket items that you at least need to be aware of. It gets so detailed, but if you're at least aware of the good faith estimate requirements, in other words, putting the patient on notice of what the charges might be, and there's timelines involved there. I'm not going to recite them here, but they are fairly accessible online.
Yeah.
That's a big one. Also, there are waiver concepts under the Act, so the patient in certain situations can waive the requirement to give them a good faith estimate or to be subject to the prohibitions, and then you can balance bill them. Those are big. And then also knowing generally how the IDR process works and the timeline that's involved.
Mhm.
Lawyers are very familiar with deadlines. I know healthcare professionals are experienced with their own deadlines, but the Act imposes new judicial deadlines where if you miss the 30-day window, and it is 30 days,
Mhm.
you can miss your ability to engage in the IDR process. And although the implications of that are a little bit fuzzy, the worst case scenario is you're left holding the bag and you're never going to get paid for the valuable services that you just
And
rendered.
that's key, is really to say if we don't have the right systems in place and we fail to meet deadlines inside of that process, then yeah, risk is the physician isn't getting paid for his or her work on behalf of that patient. So
Right.
that's important to keep in mind. As you might imagine, our podcast is pretty focused on getting physicians paid for what they've done. So that's, as I've said many times, that's the game I'm engaged in helping our physician listeners play. So that's fantastic. Other than missing deadlines in the IDR process, what are some other common pitfalls for practices?
Well, and there was one other thing. So, in terms of pitfalls, I think everybody's going to ask, well, what happens if I don't comply with the act? And it's a very
Mhm,
good question. The metaphor that I've made in the past is the rollout of this. When talking to other attorneys, it feels like the rollout of HIPAA, where it's very
mhm,
confusing. They're coming at you fast. Nobody's really sure what happens if there's a non-compliance. So the first thing I want to mention on that is that the enforcement agencies have said we're in a bit of a grace period, right?
mhm.
So they're not going to start enforcing and dropping the hammer on noncompliance right away. They understand. I mean, recent guidance came out as recently as last week, so they're aware of that, right? So that's good. But ultimately, there can be once they do start enforcing, there will be up to $10,000 penalties for each violation of the act, which is a
Yeah,
scary thought considering we're in an environment where if you're issuing multiple bills in a single occurrence of care, that might be 9 times 10,000, right? So
right.
that's a concern that I think people should be aware of. It's a little bit premature. We're not in the enforcement period yet, but I think it's safe to say in 2024, I would expect that enforcement rulings will start coming down.
We'll start to begin. Well, and those of us who are old enough to remember when HIPAA was first discussed, there was discussion about it in the late 90s, and I believe the first date they had proposed to roll it out was in 2001. And I think that it actually got rolled out in 2003. And then to your point, there was a lot of grace in there because there wasn't a lot of enforcement activity going on as the legislation was young. And then as it gets defined in the courts, that's the hard part is if you're one of those entities that gets caught early and then you're, in the midst of a court case so that the legislation can be better defined. You don't want to be that group in the middle of that. So good for practice owners to be aware of what it is, and also I think much like HIPAA, we need to right size the hype around it. We still have people that misinterpret HIPAA. Today, 20 years later, and are overly rigid in terms of what they will and will not share with their medical colleagues, and so I think to use that example, there could be some, over interpretation of when it's applicable. And so I just encourage our listeners, if there are questions, err on the side of asking more questions about it so you don't get in that space of, yeah, no one wants to pay a $10,000 fine. Absolutely no one wants to pay a $10,000 fine times nine or any bigger number. So that would be good guidance for our listeners. And now you've mentioned a couple of times there was new guidance out this week. So why don't we delve into that a little bit as it evolves here?
Yeah, yeah. So the new guidance is specifically in response to the Texas Medical Association case. And just to succinctly summarize what we talked about earlier, that case said the qualifying payment amount calculation is unfair. Um, we shouldn't give too much credit to a formula that is embedded in the healthcare payers systems, but isn't necessarily relevant to how an individual physician's experience and market value or market share um, is when determining what the amount should be paid. So the court's ruling was in favor of the Texas Medical Association. And the guidance that came out included some new factors, and I've got them here just on the list, hot off the press, I guess. But so the level of training and experience, along with quality and outcome measures of the provider, seems commonsensical, but that new guidance did reinforce that. Like I said, the market share of the provider is another. the acuity of the patient or the complexity of furnishing the service, and then demonstration of good faith on both sides.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, the essential aspect, I mean, in a way, as it affects the day-to-day operations of clinics, you don't need to worry too much about the new guidance because it's really focused on how much are you going to get paid. So it won't affect anything in terms of how you handle getting out the good faith estimates, how you handle getting out the waivers, interactions with patients. But it is more of a favorable ruling when it comes to calculating how much the doctor will get paid.
Mhm. Wonderful. So let's go back for a minute. I always do better understanding new concepts if I put some numbers to them. So why don't we use your example of the person going for maybe an urgent or emergent knee surgery? So maybe we've got a repair there. Could you just kind of walk us through what happens like when that patient checks in, and what needs to happen in order to be fully compliant with no surprises?
Right. So there's a couple things. So there are notice provisions, just like HIPAA has some notice provisions. So you need to put the patient on notice that the No Surprises Act exists and that there are prohibitions against balance billing them. The requirements in the Act say that there needs to be a posting in the facility as well as online. And there's funny language about how it has to be easily accessible via Google SEO searches and stuff like that. New world, you know. So that's the first thing. And then if you want to balance bill the patient, potentially, if there's a non-payment, you need to give them a good faith estimate of what you expect the healthcare to cost. And there are deadlines involved in the statute as to when you need to get the patient those deadlines. There's different deadlines for when it's scheduled further than 3 days out, when it's scheduled within 3 days, and when it's more of an emergency basis.
Hmm.
And then you may consider giving the patient a waiver for some of the No Surprises Act provisions. And there's certain rules on when you can do that, when you can't do that, and it's all in the act. And those ones are a little bit more easy to understand. And then once you do those things, I mean, it's a long act, but when you accomplish those three, you put yourself in a pretty good position to balance bill the patient in the event that there's non-payment. You preserved your right to do that, right? So in a way, there's an interesting market dynamic where a lot of this will be somewhat mute as long as the payer pays or the patient pays
Right.
and everything goes according to plan. But like most laws that we're concerned about, it's the one out of 1,000 that might come up that might leave your facility holding the bag on a much larger amount, which is what you have to prepare for.
Yeah, absolutely. And that thinking about that whole scenario of a patient with maybe a semi-urgent knee surgery that could wind up with a large anesthesia bill because the patient didn't control which anesthesiologist was doing it and didn't know to ask, is the anesthesiologist doing my case also in network for me? So I dislike the complexity that the legislation is adding, but I like the notion of attempting to keep a patient from a very unpleasant surprise. So it's a part and parcel of what would be a much longer conversation about how, as patients, we behave in a way, and I do this myself, even as an industry insider of 30 plus years. I am not always clear on what my benefits level are as a patient. And I'm also not always clear who is providing me care. For instance, if I have a lab test that goes to pathology or some x-ray study that is then read by a radiologist, I am not always asking up front, is that radiologist in network for me? Is that pathologist in network for me? So even as someone who should know better, I don't always behave in such a enlightened consumer patient way as I might. So I think it's really well intended legislation, much like HIPAA, really well intended legislation, and it'll be interesting to see how it evolves.
Yeah, well, the same thing, Jill. I always laugh at myself as a healthcare attorney when I'm actually getting care and I don't understand certain provisions of the care. But my wife laughs twice as hard, I will say. Um,
Uh,
but the nice thing about the bill, to give it credit, is that a lot of what they're trying to solve is the emergency services aspect of healthcare.
Yep.
And that's where even a 30-year industry insider, when you're in an emergency, you're not thinking clearly, you might be incapacitated. You can imagine all of the different complexities that might, very reasonably excuse you from asking whether the anesthesiologist is in network. And
Right.
yeah, and so the bill does a good job of trying to tackle that. Hopefully, the guidance will continue to be responsive until we get a framework that totally makes sense, but it's at least a step forward.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned a framework, and I want to call out that we have a wonderful flow chart from you from one of the early presentations you've made to our industry groups, and we will include that in the show notes. It is one of the most clear and easy to read and easy to understand guides that I've seen. So for all of our listeners, we'll put that link in the show notes so that you'll get that. We'll also put information about Grant and his background and how to reach him. If you have any follow-up questions, we'll get all of that out there as well. And I would say, in closing, Grant, if you think about the act, what do you most want our physician listeners to know?
I would say two things. One, if you tackle those big three that we mentioned earlier, the good faith estimates, understanding the IDR, and the waiver, if you implement those into your system, you're going to be accomplishing the big parts of the act, and you're going to be tackling the scarier parts as it might result in bad outcomes for the clinic.
Mhm.
So it might seem like 1,000 pages is a lot. There's a lot of technical rules in there, but if you focus on those three things to start off with, I think you're going to be putting yourself in a really good position. And then as we get more guidance, I think that you'll be in a good position to implement the more technical things over time in the same way that we saw happen with HIPAA.
Wonderful. Grant, thank you so much. I appreciate you sharing your expertise today and helping us take all this complex legislation and breaking it down so we can digest it.
It's absolutely my pleasure. I appreciate you having me on here, and I'm just impressed with both of us for not making too many No Surprises Act puns
We did
during this
well
podcast.
with keeping the puns to a low level. Thank you again. I so appreciate your time.
Absolutely, Joe.
Take care. Bye bye. You can find more information online at medicalmoneymatterspodcast.com, and you can subscribe to the Medical Money Matters content website for physician leaders to find budget templates and many other tools. We've included those links in the show notes. As I like to close out these podcasts, congratulations on taking the next step in your professional development and for making the commitment to learn about the financial and business aspects of your practice. I look forward to being on this journey with you and send you my heartfelt gratitude for all that you do for your patients all day, every day.